The myth of perfection is a dangerous thing to maintain, especially when the entire world is watching you build it. For more than 2 decades, Tom Brady lived inside a narrative that felt completely untouchable to the average observer. Championships came and went like seasonal shifts, records fell with an almost mundane predictability, and the trophies stacked up higher than those of any other athlete in human history. Yet somewhere in the vast, echoing space between the deafening noise of packed stadiums and the absolute silence of lonely hotel rooms, a subtle fracture began to form in the foundation. At 48 years old, long after the cheering crowds had finally faded into memory, the legendary quarterback ultimately had to confront a sobering truth about a loss that cut far deeper than any physical defeat he ever endured on the gridiron. It was the slow, painful dissolution of a marriage that the public genuinely believed was entirely unbreakable. When you operate at that level of visibility, people project their own ideals onto your life, assuming that immense material success naturally translates to domestic harmony, but reality is rarely that simple or forgiving. When Tom Brady and Gisele Bundchen initially married in early 2009, the union felt less like a standard celebrity romance and more like something pulled straight from ancient mythology. He was already a rapidly rising legend in the demanding realm of American football, a man completely obsessed with strict discipline, physical longevity, and an unattainable standard of absolute perfection. She, on the other hand, was indisputably the most recognizable and influential supermodel on the entire planet, representing a global, deeply independent force who was operating at the absolute zenith of her professional power. To the casual public observer, their partnership looked like a flawless balance that very few couples ever managed to successfully achieve in a lifetime. It appeared to be a brilliant pairing of fierce ambition with unyielding devotion, where immense global fame was somehow perfectly balanced by fierce commitment to domestic privacy. For many years, that beautiful illusion held strong against the relentless scrutiny of the outside world, presenting a united front that inspired envy and admiration alike, though the internal mechanics of their daily lives were far more complicated than the glossy magazine covers ever suggested. Behind the vibrant scenes of their seemingly perfect life, the reality of their marriage ran on a rigid internal structure that was permanently built around one central, unyielding truth. Football always came first, serving as the sun around which every other aspect of their family dynamic was forced to orbit without exception. Brady's entire existence followed a demanding, highly meticulous calendar that never truly offered a moment of genuine pause or emotional relaxation throughout the calendar year. Demanding training camps smoothly bled into grueling regular seasons, which then bled directly into intensive periods of physical recovery and specialized therapy. Then, almost immediately, those recovery phases turned right back into rigorous preparation for the very next championship run, leaving no room for spontaneous joy or casual family downtime. Even during the brief months that were officially labeled as the off-season, his psychological focus rarely shifted away from his ultimate athletic goals. There were grueling workouts conducted long before the morning dawn, film study sessions that stretched deep into the silent night, and corporate business meetings constantly layered on top of his intense daily physical training. This relentless, all-consuming rhythm did not suddenly change or soften when young children finally entered the picture. If anything, the logistical complexity and emotional pressure of their lives only intensified. Gisele initially adapted to this demanding reality because she possessed a profound, deep-seated belief in the long-term validity of their marital partnership. She willingly chose to step away from her own historic modeling career right at its absolute peak, consciously turning down lucrative global opportunities that most professionals could only dream of securing. She relocated her entire life across the country multiple times without public complaint, constantly rebuilding her social circles and daily routines entirely around Brady's shifting team commitments. In doing so, she gradually became the rock-solid, absolutely stable center of their growing household, the dedicated parent who single-handedly managed the chaotic daily routines. She carried the immense weight of the emotional labor, and handled the invisible, exhausting work that quietly keeps a large family functioning while the world praises the patriarch's public achievements. For years, she comforted herself by whispering that this lopsided arrangement was merely a temporary sacrifice. She repeatedly told herself that one day, the endless cycle of football would finally come to an end, and the peaceful, balanced life they had so vividly imagined together would at last begin. However, by the time Brady steadily approached his late 30s, that long-standing promise had stretched incredibly thin under the weight of reality. The children were rapidly growing older, developing their own distinct personalities and asking difficult questions about why their father was so frequently missing from the dinner table. The prolonged absences were becoming increasingly harder to logically explain away to a family that desperately needed his physical and emotional presence. Consequently, a quiet, corrosive resentment that inevitably comes from waiting far too long for a promised change began to permanently settle into the fabric of the marriage. This domestic erosion was not triggered by a single explosive argument or one particularly stressful season on the field. It was about the tragic passage of unrecoverable time without balance ever being restored to the relationship. In the deep privacy of their home, Gisele tried desperately to communicate the profound loneliness that the public never witnessed. She spoke honestly about feeling utterly alone inside the structure of their marriage, about carrying the crushing emotional weight of the entire family by herself, while Brady carried the external expectations of an entire sports culture. She did not fiercely demand that he immediately stop playing the game he loved so passionately, but she gently asked him to finally be present in their shared life. She begged him to choose his family sometimes, to consciously meet her in the middle of their emotional divide rather than always expecting her to cross over to his side. That growing gap between them, which had once felt entirely manageable during the early years of romance, was slowly and visibly becoming an unbridgeable chasm. By the time the 2000s gave way to a new decade of grueling competition, the marriage no longer felt like a beautiful, shared dream moving forward in unison. Instead, it increasingly felt like two intensely driven people running completely parallel lives, connected by a rich history, beautiful children, and deep love, but ultimately moving in entirely different directions. The fateful decision that would finally expose this heartbreaking truth to the world was looming heavily on the horizon. Long before the expensive divorce lawyers were formally called, before the painful separation rumors leaked to a ravenous sports media, and before the world began loudly speculating about ultimatums, Gisele did something incredibly quiet. She wrote a deeply personal letter to her husband, opting for a private medium that possessed a devastating clarity that no shouting match could ever replicate. It was not a dramatic document filled with theatrical flourishes, nor was it a cruel attack designed to deliberately wound his pride. It was not written in a temporary fit of blinding anger, but it was honest in a profound way that left absolutely no room for psychological denial. In that letter, she told Tom Brady something that no roaring stadium crowd or grand championship parade could ever hope to drown out. She made it painfully clear that the marriage was no longer functioning in a way that supported both of their souls. She wrote with heartbreaking sincerity that she felt as though she was essentially raising their children as a single parent, trapped in a beautiful cage. The relationship, she pointed out, functioned beautifully for exactly one person, but that success came at the immense, unacknowledged cost of the other person's happiness and personal growth. She gently reminded him that she possessed vibrant dreams of her own, professional goals and personal aspirations that she had repeatedly set aside year after year to support his legendary career. She had made those sacrifices under the trusting assumption that the heavy burden of building a life would eventually be shared equally once the athletic glory subsided. When Brady later spoke about this private letter in a rare moment of public vulnerability, he did not attempt to minimize its profound emotional impact. He openly admitted that the truth contained within those handwritten pages was incredibly brutal and deeply uncomfortable for him to hear at that stage of his life. He revealed that he still keeps that specific letter safely tucked away inside a private drawer in his house, a tangible artifact of a defining marital crisis. He reads those words sometimes, not merely as a grim reminder of what he almost lost during that specific period, but as an ongoing warning about the severe cost of emotional neglect. At the exact time the letter was written, Brady reacted in the exact way that many highly driven, successful people do when suddenly confronted with uncomfortable personal clarity. He immediately promised to change his behavior, channeling his legendary work ethic into fixing the visible cracks in his domestic life. The couple entered intensive marriage counseling, embarking on long, difficult conversations that they had successfully avoided for a generation. There were countless passionate reassurances that things would be radically different moving forward, that the football journey would eventually reach its natural conclusion, and that the family would finally take its rightful place as his primary priority. Then in the early months of 2022, Brady made a massive public announcement that seemed to definitively prove to his wife and the world that those heartfelt promises meant something real. After more than 2 decades of unprecedented dominance in the National Football League, he officially declared his retirement. He spoke eloquently to the media about finally focusing his considerable energy on other aspects of his life that desperately required his presence and protection. Gisele celebrated this monumental decision quite publicly, sharing her genuine excitement with the world regarding the commencement of a beautiful new chapter in their lives. For the first time in many years, It appeared to everyone watching that her decades of patient waiting had truly been worth the immense sacrifice. That beautiful ray of domestic hope lasted for exactly 40 agonizing days before completely shattering into a million pieces. When Brady abruptly reversed his retirement decision and loudly announced that he was returning to the football field for yet another season, the psychological reaction was immediate, devastating, and entirely irreversible. This sudden betrayal was no longer just about the sport of football or his burning desire to compete at the highest level. It was fundamentally about a total breakdown of trust, about the sacred conversations that had already occurred in private, and about the explicit life plans they had carefully made together. To Gisele, the implicit message behind his unretirement was completely unmistakable and deeply wounding to her core identity. When forced to make a definitive choice between his explicit family intentions and his deep-seated athletic instincts, Brady ultimately chose the familiar sanctuary of the football field. Sources close to the inner workings of the marriage later described that exact moment as the absolute breaking point for the relationship. It was not because she harbored a deep, irrational hatred for the sport itself, but because she felt entirely excluded from a monumental life decision that directly affected every single part of their shared existence. What hurt her the most was not the mere fact that he chose to return to the game, but the completely unilateral nature of how he executed that return. This solo decision confirmed everything that the private letter had warned him about regarding his inability to truly share a life. From that precise moment onward, the marriage quietly entered its final, tragic phase, progressing not with loud arguments but with a cold, exhausting distance between them. They were two people finally realizing that love alone, no matter how deep or historic, cannot fix a complex life built on fundamentally incompatible priorities. As Brady eagerly prepared for what would ultimately become the most emotionally painful and physically taxing season of his entire professional career, the true cost of ignoring that prophetic letter began to reveal itself. Week by week, loss by loss, the universe began to collect the debt he owed for prioritizing the stadium over his home. The highly anticipated 2022 football season was originally supposed to be a glorious, triumphant victory lap for the greatest quarterback to ever play the game. Instead, it morphed into a slow, agonizing public unraveling that played out in front of millions of critical viewers, one agonizing Sunday at a time. From the outside world's perspective, Tom Brady still looked remarkably like the same elite quarterback he had always been, presenting an image of intense focus, poise, and absolute professionalism. But inside the quiet sanctuary of the locker room and behind the heavy doors of his private life, the true cost of his unretirement was finally coming due. By the time the grueling summer training camp officially began, the very foundation of his high-profile marriage was already dangerously unstable. Brady showed up to work, but his coaches and teammates immediately noticed that something essential was missing from his demeanor. The obsessive, terrifying precision that had completely defined his professional identity for over 2 decades appeared noticeably dulled and distracted. His legendary patience with mistakes was visibly thinner, and his overall presence around the facility felt deeply divided, as if a large part of his mind was constantly trapped elsewhere. In August, he quietly stepped away from the team's mandatory training camp for nearly 2 weeks, an unprecedented move that the organization described only as a brief leave for personal reasons. No specific details were ever given to the ravenous media, but the frantic timing of the absence spoke volumes to anyone paying close attention. The deep cracks in his personal life were no longer a well-kept secret. They were now playing out on a massive public stage. As the grueling football season progressed into the autumn months, the immense physical and emotional distance between Brady and Gisele became absolutely impossible to hide from the paparazzi. They were actively living in completely separate residences, and she noticeably stopped wearing her iconic diamond wedding ring during public outings in Miami. Disturbing reports quickly surfaced in the entertainment media detailing intense, emotional arguments, and the sobering reality of high-powered divorce lawyers being formally contacted by both parties. Every devastating loss on the football field was immediately followed by another massive wave of intense media speculation regarding the impending demise of their union. Brady carried that crushing psychological weight into every single offensive snap, trying desperately to block out the noise of his personal life while reading complex defensive coverages. Physically, the immense toll of this domestic turmoil became shockingly visible to anyone who watched his post-game press conferences. He lost a very significant amount of weight in a remarkably short period, making his famous face look drawn, exhausted, and almost hollow under the bright lights. The legendary quarterback who had literally built his entire mythos on unparalleled physical durability and meticulous wellness now looked entirely depleted of life force. Former team staff members later described quiet moments inside the stadium locker room that were deeply unsettling to witness for an icon of his stature. Brady would frequently sit entirely alone after games, still dressed in his full sweat-stained uniform, staring blankly at the concrete floor without moving for incredibly long stretches of time. He was not exhibiting visible anger, nor was he crying tears of frustration. He simply looked completely empty, a shell of the competitor he used to be. This was not the standard relatable struggle of an aging athlete trying to fight off the inevitable physical decline of father time. It was the tragic, internal collapse of an ambitious human being trying desperately to hold together two massive, competing worlds that could no longer peacefully coexist. Brady himself later admitted in interviews that the intense personal turmoil took an immense amount of energy out of his soul. The situation heavily drained his natural ability to continue playing the game at the dangerously high level he demanded of himself every day. For the very first time in his legendary career, the football field was no longer acting as a safe psychological escape from reality. Instead, it had transformed into a harsh, unforgiving mirror that reflected back to him everything of true value that he was actively losing in real time. As the season dragged on into the cold winter, the heartbreaking truth of his situation became entirely unavoidable to everyone involved. The immense personal sacrifice that had once felt so noble and heroic during his 20s now felt tragically irreversible and empty. While the sports public loudly debated meaningless statistics, passing yards and fatting playoff chances, the real ending of this epic story had already been written in stone. By the time the legal paperwork was formally filed and the marriage was officially dissolved in a court of law, the season was effectively over both on the field and at home. What Brady had not yet fully confronted, however, was the reality that the painful consequences of his choices were only beginning to manifest. When the high-profile divorce became officially finalized in late October, there were no dramatic public shouting matches, no drawn-out courtroom battles, and no tell-all television interviews explaining exactly what went wrong. The legal paperwork was quietly filed and completely finalized on the exact same day, bringing a swift, unceremonious end to 13 years of marriage. On paper, the entire process looked incredibly clean, professional, and mutual, but in reality the emotional landscape was anything but tidy. Both Tom Brady and Gisele Bundchen quickly released brief, carefully curated statements on social media that were heavily centered on the ongoing protection of their children. They spoke politely about mutual respect, deep gratitude for the years shared, and a shared commitment to smoothly moving forward into the future. What they consciously chose not to say in those sterile public statements mattered infinitely more than the words they actually published. There was absolutely no public blame assigned to either party, no bitter accusations leveled, and no defensive explanations offered to the press. The heavy silence itself became a massive, looming part of the ongoing media narrative, leaving the world to wonder about the true depth of the pain involved. Several months later, Gisele finally broke that heavy silence in her very first major magazine interview since the official split. Her carefully chosen words completely reframed everything that the public thought they knew about the dynamics of their high-profile breakup. She explicitly described the tragic end of her marriage not as an angry, dramatic fight, but as a profound, deeply felt life loss. "It's like a death and a rebirth," she admitted to the interviewer with an open vulnerability that resonated with millions of readers worldwide. She spoke completely openly about genuinely mourning the tragic death of her long-held dream, a dream she had nurtured for over a decade. She clarified that she was not just mourning a specific person or a broken relationship, but an entire future that she had believed in with her whole heart. She fiercely rejected the unfair narrative that had aggressively followed her through the sports media for months, which claimed she had selfishly pressured Brady to retire. The media had painted her as a demanding wife who had forced an impossible, unfair choice upon an aging sports hero. She called that specific public idea deeply hurtful, entirely inaccurate, and a complete misrepresentation of her true heart. Football, she patiently explained to the world, was merely one small piece of a much larger, incredibly complex emotional puzzle. The real issue that ultimately destroyed their union was far simpler, more relatable, and infinitely more painful than sports statistics. Over the long course of time, despite their best efforts to stay connected, they had simply grown apart as human beings. She explained that when they first met in their youth, they genuinely wanted the exact same things from life, including a beautiful family and a grounded life together. But as the years relentlessly passed, their individual paths and personal evolutions slowly but surely began to diverge in ways that could no longer be reconciled. Loving someone deeply, she wisely noted, does not mean holding them captive inside a rigid life structure that no longer fits their soul. True love means completely allowing freedom, even when that newly found freedom ultimately leads them entirely away from you and your shared life. There was absolutely no trace of bitterness in her words, nor any lingering resentment toward the man she had spent a generation supporting. She spoke about Brady with a genuine warmth and sincere respect, stating unequivocally that she truly wanted him to be happy to succeed, and to see all his remaining dreams come true. What hurt the most was not the love disappearing from their hearts, but the tragic realization that love alone could not restore structural balance. While Brady remained mostly silent in the wake of the public split, Gisele consciously moved forward with her life in a very quiet, intentional manner. She gracefully returned to the high-fashion modeling world on her own terms, reclaiming her professional identity outside of being a football wife. She spent vast amounts of time in natural environments that deeply grounded her spirit, particularly in Costa Rica, where the daily rhythm of life felt significantly slower. She focused almost all of her considerable energy on nurturing their children, ensuring they felt completely secure amidst the massive structural changes in their family. She described their ongoing co-parenting dynamic not as an intense competition or a source of tension, but as a collaborative team effort. There were to be no winners and no losers in this divorce, just a shared, sacred responsibility to protect the young lives they brought into the world. For the viewing public, that definitive interview successfully closed a major, chaotic chapter of celebrity gossip, but for Brady himself, it opened a completely new and uncharted territory. It was a stark, quiet territory where his monumental loss was no longer just a theoretical concept or a temporary setback, but a permanent reality of his mid-40s. After his football career finally ended for good the following year, Brady tried desperately to aggressively reframe his public life and maintain a sense of control. He signed massive, record-breaking broadcasting contracts, entered into high-stakes business ventures, and made frequent public appearances designed to signal total confidence to the world. Then came a fateful decision that would ultimately return to haunt him far more than any terrible interception he ever threw on a football field. He inexplicably agreed to be the central subject of a highly publicized live comedy roast on a major global streaming platform. On paper, the entertainment venture seemed relatively harmless, a fun opportunity to celebrate his historic career while proving to his critics that he could laugh at himself. But once the live show actually began and the comedians took the microphone, the tone quickly shifted into something incredibly mean-spirited. The aggressive comedians ruthlessly mocked his highly public divorce, making crude jokes about Gisele leaving him for another man and turning his deepest private pain into cheap punchlines. Brady sat there on the stage, forced to maintain a tight, awkward smile as the cameras broadcasted his reactions to the entire world. He had no choice but to take the psychological hits. That was the explicit nature of the entertainment agreement he had signed. But the real, devastating damage of that decision did not happen on the stage. It occurred the very next day in the privacy of his home. When he next spoke to his children, the true hidden cost of that reckless career move became agonizingly clear to his fatherly heart. They had inevitably seen the viral video clips on social media, and they had heard complete strangers loudly laughing at the tragic collapse of their family unit. They looked at their father and asked him directly why he had allowed such a mean thing to happen, questioning what the ultimate point of it all was. For the very first time in his highly structured life, the master strategist had absolutely no logical answer to offer his family. He later described that heartbreaking conversation with his kids as feeling exactly like a sharp stake being driven directly through his heart. It was not a feeling of being attacked by outside critics or dealing with public anger. It was the pure, unadulterated disappointment radiating from the people whose opinions mattered most to him. He admitted to close associates that he regretted participating in the roast immediately, feeling a profound sense of shame for exposing his family to ridicule. He reached out to apologize privately to Gisele for allowing their private history to be turned into a cheap public spectacle, but apologies cannot rewind time. That painful experience forced Brady to finally confront a sobering reality that he had successfully managed to avoid for decades. It was not just the loss of his marriage, but the massive accumulated cost of always choosing the exact same professional priority over his loved ones. He finally began to acknowledge publicly that his legendary career had forced him to miss countless holidays, major milestones, and ordinary days that never make sports headlines. He realized that those quiet, ordinary days are the exact things that truly define the success or failure of a human family over time. For a man who had literally built an entire global legacy on intense preparation and total control, this was a terrifying wake-up call. It was the exact moment he realized that there are some profound losses in life that you simply cannot study away with game film or outwork with sheer physical effort. At 48 years old, Tom Brady finally spoke to the public completely without his legendary physical or psychological armor. He was no longer speaking as a flawless gridiron champion or a polished global brand, but simply as a father deeply reflecting on what remained of his life. In candid interviews, he openly admitted that his final, disastrous season in the league was heavily shaped by the intense personal turmoil raging in his private life. He confessed that the situation had completely drained his spirit and severely affected his elite ability to keep pushing his body forward. He explained to his audience that after 23 years of unprecedented success, he no longer felt like he was walking away from something unfinished on the field. What he desperately wanted now was simply time, the one precious commodity that all his millions of dollars could never buy back for him. In a deeply personal message directed to his massive fan base, Brady tried his best to explain the complicated life choices he had made over the decades. He attempted to frame his absolute, obsessive dedication to the game of football as a positive, inspiring example for his children to follow. He wanted them to see the value of total commitment, intense discipline, and the necessity of personal sacrifice to achieve greatness. But nestled deep within that logical explanation came a much quieter, infinitely softer admission of human frailty. Your actions always reflect your true priorities, he noted quietly, and absolutely no one is perfect in this life. For someone who had spent his entire existence fiercely refusing to accept failure in any form, those words represented a massive psychological shift. They were not a defensive confession of legal guilt, but a profound expression of mature human understanding and hard-earned wisdom. He finally acknowledged the reality that choosing to have everything in one area of life is fundamentally the same as choosing that specific thing over everything else of value. By the time he reached this profound level of self-reflection, Gisele had already successfully moved on with her life, completely detached from his orbit. She had carefully built a much quieter, deeply intentional existence for herself and her children, far away from the blinding glare of stadium lights. It was a life explicitly centered on emotional presence, absolute honesty, and the slow, healing rhythms of family connection. She eventually remarried in a strictly private ceremony and welcomed another beautiful child into the world, embracing a fresh start. This new chapter was not executed as a loud statement of revenge or a public display of moving on, but simply as a natural continuation of the authentic life she had wanted. Brady accepted this massive shift in her life outwardly with an admirable sense of grace, maturity, and public composure. He kept his focus entirely locked on maintaining a healthy, supportive co-parenting relationship for the sake of their growing children, frequently wishing her nothing but true happiness. Yet despite his best public relations efforts, the stark contrast between their two post-divorce realities was absolutely impossible for the public to ignore. One person had successfully managed to completely rebuild a beautiful, authentic dream from the ashes of a broken marriage. The other person was still awkwardly learning how to navigate the daily reality of living without a dream to chase. Tom Brady undoubtedly won more football games and earned more accolades than any other person in his profession ever will in the history of the sport. Yet, in the final analysis of his historic journey, this domestic fracture remained the one profound loss that he simply could not outwork.